Oh, hi. Miss being with you all. I'm gonna do a little review, exam review, and we're gonna start with the first question, which is about the global food system. And I think it's really important for you to understand this. And we did take quite a bit of time, like figuring it out. And really, the centerpiece of this question was around Stuffed and Starved, Raj Patel's book. And one of the first question is like, what does Raj mean when he says that we are stuffed and starved as a planet? So, one of the weird dynamics of our food system is that the same system produces about 1 billion hungry people and about 1.5 billion, a little more, overfed people that are getting too much food or the wrong kinds of food. And so some of us are stuffed, we're overeating, and some of us are starved, they're undereating. So he starts the book discussing how one system could produce both of these dynamics. There was a really poignant chapter called "You Have Become a Mexican," where he writes about the Korean farmer who commits suicide, and he talks about the way that the world trade had become a bomb to the poor, a B.O.M.B. And in some places there were really high subsidies. In some of the so-called industrial countries, and like for instance, every head of cattle in the European Union was subsidized 3 times the average Mexican farmer's salary. So cows were making more money than Mexican farmers. And the point of this chapter is talking about how the way international trade is being done doesn't benefit farmers and it doesn't benefit eaters, but it does benefit the very few people in the middle who benefit very handsomely from the kind of system we have. So basically, he has this hourglass, or like a martini glass, which is kind of a good kind of wealth signifying symbol, right? And as you remember, like at the top, you have all of the producers, which is a very wide part of the population. And then in the middle, you have all the people that control the flow of what is produced. And then at the bottom, you have all the eaters or the consumers. And the problem is that the people who eat and buy don't have any power in that system, and the people who produce don't have any power. It's just the people in the middle who control the way those flows are distributed and how much they're paid. He talks about, you might remember the example of the Ugandan farmer who used to be able to send their kids to school and have enough money by producing coffee. But when Vietnamese farmers also began producing coffee across the world, then the Ugandan farmer's ability to make money was totally undermined, and he couldn't make enough to pay his bills. He wasn't even able to make enough to really pay for what he was doing, but he didn't have any other way of farming, and so he was stuck doing what he was doing. It is a really sad situation where he's not producing food for his community. He's producing exports. One of the problems with the way food is talked about and farming is talked about is it's always a question of like, how are they able to export something for money? But the first job of a food system, according to Wendell Berry, is to feed its community. This doesn't seem like a very shocking or profound goal, right? Of course, farmers should be feeding their community, but really today that's far from the truth. Farmers are really there to make money, and not for themselves, but for the corporations that buy and deal in the products that are made from the farmers' commodities. So farming isn't so much a vocation that is allowed to go on to feed communities. It's supposed to make money. So there's a difference between feeding communities and creating commodities. And the system is set up right now so that if you aren't willing to trade in commodities, to produce a commodity for a market, then you're not going to survive. That's just not the way the system works. It's not what the system buys. So one of the tricks, one of the tricks that we got to figure out is how do we get all that wide group of producers, the makers, the growers, connected to that wide group of eaters, of consumers, and to go around the hourglass figure that Patel draws in his book, in order that there can be a direct market and the farmer, the maker, the grower gets a larger part of the dollar, and it's not all siphoned out by the people in the middle. You remember this on page 21, where we see this kind of hourglass figure. The point is to get people from the top and the people from the bottom connected and just go around this. Or that these folks up here, people working in agriculture, they need to control this. It's not that this pipeline of getting things processed and transported to the people who eat it needs to disappear. It just needs to be in the control of the people who actually make it, and under the control or the say of people who eat it. Right? These folks in here should not have ultimate say, because when they do, they start taking more than their share. And when they take more than their share, then they cause the folks that are producing it to have less, and they raise the price for people who are eating it, and in ways that are unfair. Right? So everybody along this line deserves a piece, but it should be equal. It shouldn't be forcing farmers to go into debt and to go into bankruptcy in order to farm. So because of the way we subsidize commodities, those commodities turn out not to be things that make us healthy. They make us overweight, and they make us diabetic. They give us hypertension and high blood pressure and heart disease. And that's just the kind of food that stores best, right? Corn, soybeans, high fructose corn syrup. All those kinds of sugar, salts, and fats that dominate our food market, turned out not to be that good for us in the quantities that we eat them, and the processed ways that we eat them. So the folks that consume those tend to be stuffed, overweight, not necessarily healthy, but unhealthy, because they eat too much, or they eat too much of the wrong things. On the other hand, when people lose their farms, the people losing their work in agriculture, they often are unable to get any kind of work, any kind of food. And in this system, if you don't have land and you don't have money, then you don't eat. No matter what the average income of the country is, no matter how much the food system produces. Often from the people that control this system and benefit richly from it, they say, well, the problem is we're not producing enough food. Right? Is that the problem? The United States produces enough grains to feed 10 billion people, and there are only 7 billion people. That's just the U.S., a small part of the world. We throw away enough food each year to feed about all of the world's hungry. It's just stuff we throw away in the world, from 1.2 to 2 billion tons of food a year annually. So that would feed all the world's hunger. So the question is it really that we need to produce more food? We already have more than we need. And here's the weird thing. When you have too much of something, the value of it goes down, right? So producing more food actually causes the farmer to have less income, because their farm products are worth less because there's too much of them. Just like the Ugandan coffee farmer. When there was too much of it because of production across the world in Vietnam, then their price bottomed out. So it turns out too much of something turns out to be a curse, a resource curse. So no, we don't need more food. Too much food is what drives the price down. We end up throwing away way too much of it already. What we need is an equitable distribution of land. We need to be able to control, as producers and eaters, the transportation and the processing of the farm products. So we need cooperatives that can do that for the benefit of the farmer and the eater, and not just for the benefit of shareholders, to enrich them. So there needs to be some kind of control that we have as producers and as eaters of the farm system. So those are some of the big things to know about the global food system. One of my questions was, what is happening to farmers around the world because of our globalized food system? When wealthy countries trade with poorer countries, the wealthier countries that give money to their farmers end up producing things like corn and soybeans and wheat for artificially cheap prices. When they take that artificially cheap corn and they dump it on a country, say Mexico, and the United States dumps it on Mexico, well, they can sell it for less than it costs to produce it. And that's exactly what was happening. Once we took down the trade protections in North America, in the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, then Mexico was no longer able to protect Mexican farmers against cheap American corn. And so there was corn showing up on the Mexican market for $2 a bushel. Well, it takes $3 a bushel to produce it. The United States government, through agricultural subsidies, was making up that extra dollar to the American farmer to make it artificially cheap, right? Because there was too much of it. And so they said, well, whatever your cost is below what you're actually able to sell it as, we'll make that up. The Mexican government couldn't do that. It wasn't as wealthy. It didn't have those kind of subsidies. So what ended up happening was the Mexican farmers were simply unable to compete against cheap American corn. And as a result, within 10 years of NAFTA being instituted in 1994, over 1.5 million Mexican farmers left their land. And where did they leave their land to do? They went to the fields of the United States to pick food. They went to the meat processing plants of the United States to process beef, and pork and chicken. They went to the fields to harvest fruit, and they went to many of the restaurants to work in the kitchens where that food was produced. So the people of Mexico and Central America, because of those trade pressures, lost their ability to make money and had to flee. They're economic refugees of a so-called free trade system. And they were forced here. And when we talk about, all the demagoguery around the immigration issue, you never hear politicians talking about, oh, well, their livelihood was destroyed by an unfair trading agreement. That trade agreement created the situation. And so until we're willing to remedy the source of the problem, we're not going to remedy the problem with walls. So that's one way in which the global trade system we have hurts the poor. The last question there was, how is COVID-19 connected to the dynamics of the industrial food system and our globalized economy? Well, because we live in such a tightly knit, globalized world, we travel a lot. right? We're on the plane a lot. So if there's a disease anywhere, it's going to get everywhere very quickly. That's just one of the consequences of a tightly knit world. I'm not making a case against that here. I can make it elsewhere. I'm just saying that because we fly everywhere and move everywhere very quickly, if anything's anywhere, anything's going to be everywhere fairly quickly. And so the dynamics of pandemics are going to increase or continue as long as our connectivity and our fast travel continues. As long as the trade that happens internationally continues, we're going to have a lot of trouble controlling outbreaks that happen anywhere. But more specifically, as the poor are pushed into more and more marginal lands, pushed to destroy fragile places where there are wild creatures in jungles or deep in forests, and they are going to come in contact with the kind of viruses, novel viruses that they have, that COVID-19, of which COVID-19 is one, right? And so we're talking about bats maybe transmitting this to, not to humans, but to another animal, and from that other animal to humans. This is something that we're seeing more of. So the industrial food system creates conditions that are filthy, right? A bunch of animals crowded together. If those animals get exposed to, say, a bat, and if that disease is able to transfer, zoonotic diseases can transfer from them to humans. That's what zoonotic means. You come from one animal to another human animal. And so industrial agriculture creates the perfect breeding ground for terrible diseases. Many of our most recent diseases, including H1N1 and the many of the foodborne diseases that have killed quite a few people. Last I checked, it was the 14th. It was the 14th highest way to die in the United States was foodborne illnesses, right? And so crowded, filthy conditions of factory farms create a perfect breeding ground for the kind of diseases that we're seeing break out into human populations. Combine that with a tight globalized economy where everybody's moving, and it's easy to see how it jumps back from the wild places that we're invading into the animals that we keep in poor ways, into the humans that are there and then traveling around. So yeah, that's the first question about the globalized food system.